It began on a clear November night, the kind that makes the lights of San Francisco shimmer like a mirage. From the penthouse suite atop a glass and steel tower in the heart of the city, Ethan Carrington stood alone, hands in his pockets, staring out at the dark waters of the bay. People said he had everything: wealth, power, prestige. But in that moment, Ethan knew something was missing. Not love. That was a word he'd stopped trusting years ago. What was missing was certainty. The gnawing instinct in his gut had grown louder these past few months, whispering that the world he'd so carefully built wasn't as airtight as he believed. And he was right. 3 days later, he would discover that the woman he had loved and protected for almost a decade, his wife Lena, had been planning his betrayal for over a year. That the man she had chosen over him was a penniless, silver-tongued art dealer from Brooklyn. That the brother-in-law he had mentored, trusted, promoted, Elliot, had helped her steal from him. Not just money, but legacy, reputation, peace. They took $15 million in cash, but what they couldn't take was what Ethan still had in abundance: time, intelligence, and an ice-cold capacity for revenge. This is not just a story about betrayal, it's a story about control, about how a man, blindsided by those closest to him, decided not to collapse, but to rise, to turn their escape into a cage, to give them a new life, but only on his terms. And the best part? They never saw it coming. Ethan Carrington wasn't born into wealth. Raised in the shadow of the Chicago skyline by a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse, he learned early on that survival wasn't about strength, it was about precision. After graduating top of his class from MIT and serving in a covert cybersecurity unit within the U.S. military, he founded Sentinel Risk Group. Within 10 years, it became one of the most elite private intelligence firms in North America, handling the kind of problems no one else could touch: blackmail, corporate espionage, high-stakes asset recovery. He had built his empire from shadows, but even the sharpest minds can be blinded by the illusion of affection. He met Lena at a gala in Paris. She was working the event, not attending it, a luxury event planner with effortless poise and fire behind her eyes. She made him laugh. She challenged him. She wasn't intimidated by his resume, his watch, his car. For the first time in years, he felt disarmed. Human. Within 6 months, they were married in a private ceremony in Santorini. He gave her the world: designer penthouses, a private driver, diamond necklaces, a credit line that could buy a vineyard in Tuscany. She smiled. She said thank you. She made love like she meant it. And maybe for a while she did. But Ethan noticed the change. It started subtly. The way she checked her phone and hid the screen. How she smiled less and traveled more. She stopped asking about his work, and when he offered, she said, "You're always so intense, Ethan." That word stuck to his ribs like broken glass. It was Lena who suggested Elliot join Sentinel as a financial analyst. "He's smart," she said. "Just needs a break." Ethan gave him one. Trained him. Promoted him. The betrayal cut deepest, not because it came from strangers, but because he had invited it in. Built it a bedroom. Called it family. The contract that changed everything came on a rainy Wednesday morning. Ethan had been negotiating with a client from Eastern Europe, a deal requiring absolute discretion, substantial on-ground protection, and no questions asked. They wanted cash. That was fine. Ethan had done more dangerous jobs for less. When he closed the deal, $15 million was wired into the city in sealed carbon cases. Clean bills. Untouchable. He brought them home, thinking he'd lock them in his vault the next morning. That night, Lena wrapped her arms around him, whispered congratulations, and said she was proud of him. He kissed her, then waited for her to fall asleep. At 2:34 a.m., he accessed the internal server for his home surveillance system. Every room, every angle, every microphone, his own creation. And what he heard changed everything. "She doesn't suspect a thing," Lena whispered into her phone. Ethan's stomach turned ice. 15 million. "Tomorrow," she continued. "Once we have it, Ryan will meet us near Lake Placid. Elliot says the house is ready. After that, Costa Rica." Then she laughed. A soft, breathy laugh Ethan hadn't heard in months. He'll be too busy being Ethan. Always planning. Always in control. But not this time. She hung up. Ethan stared at the screen. No emotion on his face. No outburst. No trembling hands. Only silence. The following morning, he called off the bank transfer. He called a private tech team to re-engineer the cases, replacing the real cash with counterfeit bills topped with a thin layer of authentic notes. Each case was fitted with thermal-triggered GPS, audio beacons, and an emergency chemical tracer that could survive incineration. And then he waited. The day Lena made her move, Ethan left early for a client meeting, leaving the cases in the secure cabinet, the key hidden in the drawer she always peeked into. By nightfall, she was gone. So was the money. Elliot's car was spotted leaving the underground garage. Ethan, dressed in worn jeans and a flannel shirt, returned home with a single paper bag of groceries, whistling softly. He looked around the empty apartment. Her perfume still lingered in the air. A glass of wine half-finished on the counter. He poured himself a scotch, made a police report, and summoned his head of operations. The official story: robbery, domestic betrayal, a missing wife and $15 million in stolen assets. Detectives showed up within hours. The media picked it up by day 3. Public sympathy poured in. Poor Ethan Carrington, betrayed by his beautiful wife and her scumbag lover. Behind the scenes, Ethan was monitoring the trio's every move. They drove cross-country under aliases, stopped at motels in Denver, Des Moines, and Syracuse. By the time they reached the Lake Placid cabin, Ethan had 186 hours of audio recordings. Ryan talked about art galleries in Europe. Elliot argued about laundering timelines. Lena began to fantasize about sunsets and mojitos, far from the cold, calculating world of her husband. What they didn't know was that Ethan wasn't just watching them. He was writing their next chapter. And here's where the real story begins. You thought the betrayal was the twist? That the wife running off with her lover was the shock? No. The shock is what Ethan does next, not with bullets or rage, but with structure, with clarity, with purpose. Because Ethan wasn't interested in catching them. He wanted to own them, and by the time they realized the truth, they wouldn't be begging for forgiveness. They'd be begging for the life they thought they stole. If you're still with us, this is just the beginning. What happens next will shatter every idea you've had about justice, betrayal, and control. If you're hooked and want to hear how this story unfolds, support us by subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. It helps more than, and keeps us inspired to bring more shocking, emotional stories just like this one. Now, before you move on to part 2, here's a quick question for you to answer in the comments. Question: if you were in Ethan's position, your spouse steals $15 million and runs away with a lover, what would you do? A. Forgive them and move on. B. Report them to the authorities immediately. C. Do nothing and let karma handle it. D. Plan a strategic, long-term revenge like Ethan did. Drop your answer in the comments. We'd love to hear your take. And now, get ready. The rain came down hard that night, hammering the tin roof of the abandoned cabin in Lake Placid like nature's own interrogation. Inside, Lena Carrington stood barefoot on the old wooden floor, staring at the open cases filled with what she believed to be $15 million in pristine $100 bills. Her fingers trembled as she closed one of the cases, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. It was the kind of smile that only came after months of planning, stolen kisses, and late-night whispers in the dark. But the smile didn't reach her eyes. Not really. Across the room, Ryan Holloway leaned against the wall, cigarette dangling from his lips. He looked exhausted, but alert. His lean frame cast a shadow on the wall behind him, one that seemed far larger than the man himself. A former, rising star in New York's art scene, he had once been praised for his emotional realism and moody palettes. Now he was a fugitive, though he didn't feel like one. If anything, he felt free for the first time in years. 15 million, he said softly, exhaling a stream of smoke. You ever think you'd get this far? Lena didn't answer. She walked over to the window and looked out into the mist-drenched woods, as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the darkness. Elliot Price, her older brother, was downstairs, triple-checking the cabin's generator and securing the blinds. Always the pragmatist, Elliot had insisted on planning every detail: the route, the fuel stops, the burner phones. He'd routed them through small towns, off-grid roads, and unregistered motels. Every precaution had been taken, every risk measured, except one. They had assumed Ethan Carrington would break, but Ethan hadn't broken. He had simply disappeared from their radar, and that was far more dangerous. They didn't know that while they drove across state lines, while they hid behind forged documents and burner numbers. Ethan's private surveillance team followed from a safe distance. They had eyes on the cabin before Lena ever stepped foot on the porch. They had drone footage, thermal scans, and AI-aided audio transcription software recording every conversation in real time. Because Ethan didn't just want to know where they were, he wanted to know who they had become. From a mobile command center, parked half a mile down an old fire road, Ethan sat in the back of a matte black tactical van, flanked by Logan Reyes, his chief field operative, and Delia Ward, a quiet but lethal counterintelligence specialist. Ethan's face was unreadable, eyes fixed on the screen that displayed a live feed from inside the cabin. He watched Lena laugh at one of Ryan's jokes. Watched Elliot pace nervously, calculator in hand, murmuring about wire transfers and exchange rates. They really think they're in control, Delia muttered, shaking her head. Ethan said nothing. He leaned forward slightly, increasing the volume. Costa Rica in 4 days, Elliot said. I've got the new identities confirmed through the guy in Belize. We lay low until the passports come in. Once they're in hand, we fly out of Montreal. No red flags, no trace. And the money? Ryan asked. That much cash isn't easy to move. We won't move it all at once, Elliot replied. 10% here, 5% there. I've got 5 different laundering paths set up through crypto and offshore shell accounts. I've been testing them for 6 months. Lena nodded. You've thought of everything. Elliot gave her a faint smile. You married a control freak. I learned from the best. The irony of that sentence was not lost on Ethan. Back in the van, Logan turned to Ethan. So what's the call? We move in now? Ethan shook his head. Not yet. Logan raised an eyebrow. They've got the cases. The notes are in place. We've got confirmation they're trying to leave the country. This is textbook asset recovery. You don't want to make a statement? Ethan's lips curled into a thin smile. Not yet. Let them think they've won. Control, for Ethan, was never about force. It was about timing. About psychological disassembly. He didn't want just their bodies. He wanted their belief. He wanted them to think, with every ounce of hope they had left, that they were going to get away with it. And then he would take that belief from them. Slowly, precisely, and without apology. Back at the cabin, Lena was starting to feel the pressure. She couldn't sleep. She wandered the house at night, opening and closing drawers, checking the locks. Once, she thought she saw something move in the trees beyond the cabin, but Ryan told her it was just a deer. Still, she kept checking. She wasn't paranoid. She was haunted. Not by guilt. Lena had moved past guilt long ago, but by the knowledge that Ethan had always been the smartest person in the room. And she hadn't seen his face since the night she left. No angry texts, no desperate voicemails, just silence. And that scared her more than any gun ever could. Elliot, meanwhile, was growing frustrated with Lena's nerves. "You've got to hold it together," he told her one morning, after she snapped at Ryan for overcooking the eggs. "We're almost there. We made it farther than anyone thought we could." "Exactly," she hissed. "It's too smooth. That's what scares me." Ryan put a hand on her shoulder. "You're just tired. Once we're on the beach with mojitos in hand, this will all feel like a dream." But it didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a trap. What none of them knew was that Ethan had prepared not just fake money, but fake freedom. The IDs they'd bought were from a shell company registered under a false Belizean front, one owned by a holding group that Ethan controlled. The villa they were headed to in Costa Rica? It didn't exist. The travel agent they'd emailed? An AI chatbot programmed by Ethan's own cybersecurity team? Everything they believed they had organized on their own had been quietly, invisibly, guided. They weren't escaping. They were walking into the second act of Ethan's masterpiece. At Sentinel's headquarters in San Francisco, Ethan had personally overseen the transformation of 3 identities, aliases that would place Lena, Elliot, and Ryan into different corners of the world, where they'd be monitored, tracked, and kept under tight digital surveillance. Each of them would be placed in a job custom-built to exploit their talents and their weaknesses. Lena, who once curated galas for billionaires, would now lead a charity for women recovering from domestic abuse, an ironic sentence for a woman who used the illusion of victimhood to justify betrayal. Elliot, obsessed with control and numbers, would become the internal fraud investigator for one of Sentinel's risk subsidiaries, watching others commit crimes he was once willing to commit himself. And Ryan, the artist, the dreamer, he would manage a struggling gallery in Chicago, funded anonymously by Ethan, where every piece sold would come with the knowledge that someone else decided whether he succeeded. Ethan believed in poetic justice, and this was just the overture. The cabin settled into a routine of whispered conversations, tension, and vague plans. Ethan made one final call, to an old friend in the NYPD. A tip was delivered, a possible location of the Carrington fugitives. But it wasn't the real location. It was another cabin, another decoy. Let the cops spin in circles, Ethan thought. Let the story deepen. The longer they chase ghosts, the colder the real trail becomes. The public would slowly lose interest. Eventually, the headlines would fade, and the world would move on. And that's when Ethan would strike, because he didn't want justice. He wanted control, and control required patience. As the second week passed, Lena woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. She walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and drank orange juice straight from the bottle. Then she walked to the living room, sat down in front of the cases, and stared at the money. Her mind wandered to the way Ethan used to look at her during meetings. Quiet, intense, as if reading her soul. She remembered how he once said, "I don't punish betrayal. I erase it." She had laughed then. Now the words echoed. She didn't know where he was, but she knew he was watching. And somewhere, in the tactical van hidden in the woods, Ethan blinked as her voice came through the speakers. "Elliot," she whispered later that night, unaware of the mic recording her breath. "What if he's letting us do this? What if this is what he wants?" Elliot didn't respond right away. Then we better run faster. They wouldn't, and Ethan knew it. The extraction plan had begun. Not for the money, for them, for their souls. And when it was time to collect, they'd discover that freedom wasn't the reward. It was the illusion. The sky over Lake Placid was gray and unmoving, a dull sheet of winter hanging low above the treetops. In the early morning hush, the only sounds that broke through the silence were the soft crunch of damp earth under booted feet and the barely audible crackle of encrypted radios in motion. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer filled with quiet confidence or whispered promises of a new life abroad. The air was heavy, watchful, like the walls themselves knew the secret they had all been trying to ignore. Lena sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped together, so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Across from her, Ryan scrolled through a secure messaging app on his burner phone, tapping out coded messages to a contact they had paid dearly for. Someone who promised forged passports and safe transport to Montreal within 72 hours. Elliot. Paste. Again. I don't like it, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The delay's too long. If the passports were legit, we'd have them by now. Lena didn't reply. She kept her gaze fixed on the coffee table where 2 carbon fiber cases sat, motionless, packed with what they believed was their ticket to freedom. $15 million. A future. A clean break from the man she once loved. And yet every part of her screamed that they were being watched. She couldn't shake the sensation, like eyes pressed invisibly against her skin. Ryan finally looked up from his phone. We've got to move soon. I say we leave tonight. Montreal's 5 hours. We drive straight through. Elliot shot him a glare. And show up with counterfeit IDs without confirmation the route is secure? That's suicide. Lena stood, abruptly, cutting through the rising tension. Enough. They both turned to her. We made it this far by being smart, not emotional. We wait. 2 more days, just like the plan. She looked toward the window. He doesn't know where we are. But even as she said it, she didn't believe it. Miles away, hidden beneath a camouflaged tarp in the snowy thicket, Ethan Carrington lowered his thermal scope. His expression didn't change, but Logan could see the faint exhale of satisfaction. They're breaking down, Logan said quietly. Fractures starting to show. Ethan didn't answer right away. He turned to Delia, who sat in the mobile command unit nearby, headphones over her ears, listening to the cabin's audio feed. They're expecting IDs in 2 days, she confirmed. Sounds like they're ready to bolt if anything goes wrong. Let them, Ethan said finally. 1 more night. The team had been in position for nearly 48 hours. 4 tactical units, 2 drones, and surveillance coverage so complete it mirrored a military operation. Ethan didn't want bloodshed. What he wanted was compliance, shock, control. Every breath the trio took inside that cabin had been anticipated. The last 2 weeks had been the slow unfurling of a net, unseen, silent, and inevitable. But now it was time to tighten the cords. As dusk fell over the woods, the operation began to move. Silently, efficiently. Men and women in matte black gear, fanned out, surrounding the cabin at a wide radius. No shouting, no sirens, just pressure, applied with surgical precision. Inside, Lena's eyes snapped open from a shallow sleep. She'd dozed off on the couch, but something had woken her. She sat up, alert. Ryan was in the kitchen, Elliot upstairs, checking their equipment. Nothing seemed out of place. And then she saw it. A flicker. A shadow. Just outside the window, her breath caught in her throat. Ryan, she called, voice low. Did you see that? He moved quickly to the living room. What? There was someone outside. He went to the window and peered through the blinds. Nothing, just the snow and trees. You're spooked, he said. It's just nerves. But she wasn't so sure. Elliot came downstairs, holding a duffel bag. We need to prep for an emergency exit. If something feels wrong. Before he could finish his sentence, the room exploded in white light. Floodlights. Blinding. Every window lit up like a theater stage. A booming voice echoed from outside. "This is the Boston Police Department. Step outside with your hands visible." They froze. Lena's knees gave out. She fell onto the floor beside the couch. Ryan cursed under his breath, grabbing one of the cases. "No!" Elliot shouted. "No sudden moves, they'll shoot!" Another voice rang out. "Come out now! We will enter by force." There was no time to think, no time to argue. They looked at one another, faces pale, lips trembling. Then slowly, they opened the front door. Outside, what looked like a full SWAT team stood waiting. Red beams from laser sights painted their chests. Drones hovered overhead, capturing every second. They were ordered to their knees, handcuffed, searched. No one said Ethan's name. No one needed to. Within 15 minutes, they were loaded into 3 separate unmarked vans and driven away. Blindfolded, with no idea where they were going. They thought they were headed to federal custody. They were wrong. The caravan traveled through the night, crossing into Colorado by dawn. The destination, a sprawling estate in the Rockies. Isolated, beautiful, surrounded by forests and mountains, completely off the grid. There, beneath a luxurious main house, lay a subterranean facility. Climate-controlled, soundproof, high-tech. It was part sanctuary, part prison, and it had been custom-built by Ethan's team over the past year, long before Lena had even spoken her first lie. They were each placed in separate rooms, minimal but not cruel. There were beds, clean bathrooms, meals brought in daily, books, music, no locks on the doors but no means of escape. And then, finally, the confrontation. Ethan chose Elliot first. The reunion was quiet, the room bare except for a metal table and 2 chairs. Logan stood behind Ethan as silent backup, but Ethan didn't need him. His voice was calm. Surgical. "You disappointed me," Ethan said simply. Elliot looked like a ghost, his eyes sunken, face hollow from the stress. "This is illegal," he rasped. "No," Ethan said. "It's unconventional, but not illegal. You're here because you stole from me, not just money. You helped orchestrate a betrayal. You used the access I gave you, my company, my trust, my resources, to rip the ground from under me. I had my reasons. I know them all." Ethan replied, "I know you resented me. I know you thought I was controlling. But Elliot, what you never understood is that control isn't domination. It's responsibility. You never had the spine for that." Elliot lowered his head, defeated. "You're lucky I'm not vindictive," Ethan added. "You get a second chance. But on my terms." He laid out the deal. New identity, new job, financial oversight at a firm Ethan owned, moderate pay, supervision, no escape, no contact with Lena or Ryan, service for 15 years. Elliot didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. Next was Ryan. He was less subdued, still trying to charm his way through it. "You've got style. I'll give you that," Ryan said. "I expected prison, not this fortress." Ethan studied him. "You were an artist once." "I still am." "No," Ethan said. "Now you're mine." He laid out the terms. An art gallery in Chicago. Modest income, real clients, real pressure, but zero autonomy. "You'll be free to create," Ethan said. "But everything you build, everything you profit from, will be monitored. Because I want you to know that even when you succeed, it's because I allow it." Ryan swallowed hard. "And if I say no, then you vanish. Into a black hole of criminal prosecution that I will personally construct." And this conversation never happened. Ryan looked away. Finally, Ethan visited Lena. She stood at the window of her room, wrapped in a cream sweater, her expression unreadable. She turned slowly when he entered. "I knew it was you," she said softly. "I never stopped watching," he replied. There was a silence between them that pulsed like static. "You could have ruined us," she said. "Why didn't you?" Ethan stepped closer. "Because ruin is temporary. This, what I've built for you, it lasts." She blinked back something. Regret, maybe. Or rage. "I loved you," she whispered. "No," Ethan said, voice barely audible. "You loved the life. And when you thought you could take it, you tried. That was your mistake." He gave her the same offer. New identity. A charity in Austin, helping women who felt trapped, just like she once claimed to be. "You'll help them rebuild," he said, "while you rebuild yourself, one broken piece at a time." When she didn't answer, he nodded once. "You'll thank me one day." He left the room, the door closing quietly behind him. The capture was complete, not through violence, but through consequence. They thought they had run from him. In truth, they had run straight into his hands. 2 years had passed since Lena Carrington. Ryan Holloway and Elliot Price were captured and offered a choice: federal prison and disgrace, or new identities under complete control, bound by rules designed not only to punish, but to reform. They had chosen survival. But survival, as they soon learned, came with its own kind of suffering. Lena lived in Austin, Texas now. Her name changed, her life condensed into rigid schedules and monitored communications. She had been installed as the director of the Harmony House Foundation, a nonprofit for women rebuilding their lives after abuse. Irony, Ethan had once whispered in her ear before walking out of her holding room, is often the sharpest knife. Her face was now used in press releases, her hands signing, documents meant to represent hope, and from the outside, she seemed to fit the role. But behind her eyes was a different story. She hadn't heard Ryan's voice in over 2 years. She hadn't seen Elliot's face since the day they were separated in Colorado. Her life moved in, straight lines, but her thoughts swirled in circles. Every month, she received her paycheck, 30% of which was automatically deducted and sent to an anonymous account. She never asked where it went. She already knew. It went back to Ethan, back to the man who had turned their betrayal into a sentence of servitude. The constraints were suffocating. Lena wasn't allowed to travel without clearance. She couldn't use any unapproved device, had quarterly performance evaluations, and submitted to biannual psychological assessments. It was a cage made of policies and polished professionalism. And yet, the thing that truly gnawed at her wasn't the confinement. It was the silence. It was the haunting suspicion that she was being watched not just by technology, but by intention. That Ethan, wherever he was, still saw her, still judged her, still owned her story. In Chicago, Ryan lived under a different kind of pressure. The gallery Ethan placed him in, the Glass District Collective, had grown beyond expectations. With funding from anonymous backers and a location curated to attract both up-and-comers and elite buyers, it had become a cultural staple in the city's art scene. Ryan, now operating under the name Colton Dean, played the role well. He shook hands with critics, mentored young talent, and even began hosting monthly exhibits. But success tasted hollow. He couldn't touch any real profits. Everything went through a network of approvals. His emails were scrubbed before he ever saw them. His phone calls were recorded. He knew because the gallery's security system was modeled after the one Ethan once described to him in a conversation he never realized was being tested. What hurt more than the surveillance was the emptiness. He created art again, raw, moody, complex, but it meant nothing. It wasn't rebellion, it was tribute. Every brushstroke was still under Ethan's shadow. He thought of Lena often, wondered where she was, if she ever looked for him, if she hated him now for what they had done. or if she hated herself more. In Seattle, Elliot was faring better, or at least he told himself he was. He'd been assigned as a fraud detection consultant for a financial compliance firm that contracted under Sentinel. His job was to find people like his former self, people who thought they were smarter than the system. He caught them too, dozens. But every night, he sat alone in his apartment and stared at the wall, knowing he was only here because he had been caught first. At first, he had obeyed out of fear. Now he obeyed because it was the only thing he could do. Yet even the most disciplined prisoner dreams of rebellion, and Elliot had always been cleverer than he let on. The first crack appeared not in the system Ethan built, but in the people forced to live inside it. Lena initiated contact. It started with a comment on a little-known online journal that reviewed women-led nonprofits. She left a vague, philosophical quote in the comments section of an article. Some cages are so beautifully crafted, the bird forgets it ever had wings. It was a reference she and Ryan had shared once, during a trip to Vienna, years ago, long before betrayal and strategy overtook affection. Ryan saw it a week later. His gallery had been profiled in the same publication, and the algorithm fed him the quote. He stared at it for a long time. It was subtle, it was nothing, but it was her. Over the next 3 months, they developed a system. Code buried in the noise, disguised references in comment sections, coordinates disguised as color hex codes in artwork titles. It was slow, meticulous, designed to evade the digital tripwires Ethan had set in place, or so they thought. They began building an escape plan. Ryan knew a man who worked in the art scene in Mexico City, someone with connections to document forgers and silent brokers. Lena reached out to a local contact she had met through the foundation, someone who worked with shelters that offered underground relocation services for women fleeing violence. Elliot, when they reached him, through a shared favorite subreddit about encrypted data systems, agreed to help. He'd design the protocol. He'd hide the trail. But he wouldn't go with them. I've accepted what I am, he told Lena in the one message he sent. But I won't stop you. Just be smarter than I was. It took them 7 more months to accumulate enough untraceable cash. Every dollar hidden in cash-only tips, art sales redirected through anonymous donors, and charitable event earnings, siphoned into private safes. They bought new IDs, mapped out a route through Arizona, and scheduled the escape for early spring, when border traffic was lower and distractions more common. They thought they were free. They thought they had beaten the system. But Ethan had never stopped watching. His cybersecurity team was the best in the country. And they hadn't just been watching their communications. They had been watching their silence. It wasn't that Lena's foundation work suddenly grew quiet. It was how quiet, how perfectly compliant she had become. That kind of behavior, Ethan knew, was never pure. It was performance. And he was an expert in performances. He brought in Logan again. Quiet meeting, private location, no cameras. They're trying something, Ethan said. Logan didn't even blink. All 3? No. Elliot is distancing himself, but he's helping. He's the smartest of the 3. I trained him. Logan nodded. Do you want to stop them now? Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. I want to see how far they'll go. Because the system Ethan had created wasn't just about punishment. It was about temptation, about testing the human will against the illusion of freedom. And now, after 2 years, the experiment was entering its final phase. 2 weeks before the scheduled escape, Lena quit her job at the foundation under the guise of personal health reasons. Ryan claimed he was taking a sabbatical to focus on a new series. Their friends, carefully cultivated over 2 years, sent messages of support. No one suspected a thing. They met in Tucson, rented a car under new names, and drove south toward the Mexican border near Nogales. The car was loaded with documents, cash, burner phones, and a map etched with notes so faint they could only be seen under UV light. When they reached the checkpoint, it was late. The sun had set. The guards seemed sleepy, disinterested. They handed over their passports. The guard studied them for a moment, then smiled. "Welcome to Mexico," he said. They drove through, hands trembling, hearts pounding. They had done it. The hotel in Nogales was small, tucked between an abandoned cinema and a marketplace. They opened a bottle of champagne, the cheap kind, and laughed. A real laugh, full, breathless, desperate with joy. Lena cried. Ryan held her. For the first time in years, they believed in tomorrow. They didn't know the border was a set. That the guards worked for Ethan. That the Mexican hotel was part of an elaborate stage designed not just to fool them, but to make them feel everything they had once taken from him. Hope. And then, at 3:18 a.m., the door burst open. Flashlights. Commands, handcuffs, shouts in Spanish. They were dragged into the hallway, still half-dressed, the taste of champagne still on their lips. "You are under arrest for the theft of $15 million, one officer said in clear, accented English. "You will be extradited to the United States immediately," Lena screamed. Ryan shouted something incoherent, but it didn't matter. By the time the sun rose, they were back on U.S. soil, but not in federal custody, back in Colorado, back in Ethan's hands. He greeted them not with rage, but with a glass of water and a cold smile. "Did you enjoy your night of freedom?" he asked. They couldn't speak. "I built that world for you," he said. "Just as you tried to build one without me." He turned to Lena. "I gave you structure. You tried to shatter it. So now, I'll give you chaos." He turned to Ryan. "I gave you success. You tried to twist it into rebellion. So now I'll give you silence." He stood, looked at both of them with eyes that saw everything. "You still don't understand. This was never about revenge." He leaned closer. "This was about reminding you that you were never, not even for a moment, free." He walked out, and the doors locked behind him. 5 years had passed since the night Ethan Carrington discovered that his wife, Lena, had betrayed him. 5 years since Ryan Holloway's smug laughter echoed on surveillance tapes. 5 years since Elliot Price, the brother-in-law Ethan had once mentored, used that mentorship to help orchestrate the theft of $15 million in cash. And 5 years since Ethan made a choice, not to punish with fire, but with silence and structure. Not to destroy them outright, but to slowly take ownership of every breath they took. Now the structure itself was beginning to strain. In the heart of downtown Boston, high above the harbor where Ethan's penthouse overlooked the city like a watchtower, he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. There was a stillness to him, not of peace, but of control so tightly held it appeared serene. Logan Reyes stood a few feet behind, reading a file in his hands. "They're starting to wear thin," Logan said quietly. Ryan hasn't spoken since his return from Arizona. Lena's completing tasks, but mechanical. There's no effort anymore. Elliot's withdrawn from contact with his handlers. Ethan didn't turn. That's what 5 years does. "You think they've learned anything?" "That depends on what you define as learning," Ethan replied. "They understand the consequences now. That's enough." But even as he said it, Ethan knew something else had shifted. Something even he hadn't fully anticipated. Control, when exerted for too long, stops being a method and starts becoming a burden. And Ethan, for all his brilliance, had begun to feel the weight of it. He had built a system so intricate, so foolproof, that it now required a constant feed of his attention, his resources, his judgment. And then came the knock. Not on his office door, but metaphorically, through an unexpected visitor. Olivia Greer, once a quiet detective who had handled the original police report filed by Ethan the night Lena disappeared, had left the force and become a private investigator. After years away from the case, Something had drawn her back. Instinct, perhaps. Or unfinished business. She showed up at Sentinel's reception, carrying only a leather bag and a file that she refused to hand to anyone but Ethan himself. He met her in a private boardroom. The air between them was polite but electric. "I don't expect pleasantries," she said, placing the file on the table between them. "But I do expect answers." Ethan didn't touch the file. "That's quite an opening line, Ms. Greer. It's been 5 years. 3 people vanished after, being accused of stealing $15 million. No charges, no trial, no follow-up. And then suddenly, a nonprofit in Texas has a director who doesn't exist before 2019. An art gallery in Chicago managed by a man with no social footprint before 2020. And a financial consultant in Seattle, who fits the profile of Elliot Price, only with a different name and just enough background noise to sound convincing." "What are you saying?" Ethan asked evenly. "I'm saying," she leaned forward, "that it looks like you didn't call the police for help. You called them as cover. You handled your revenge in-house, which means right now I'm sitting across from a man who didn't just recover stolen money. He created an invisible prison, and they've been living in it ever since." He didn't flinch. "Those are strong assumptions, Ms. Greer." "Not assumptions," she replied. "But I didn't come here to threaten. I came to understand." He considered her. There was nothing in her eyes but a quiet, relentless pursuit of truth. "Let's say you're right," he said after a long silence. "Let's say I did create a system, not out of malice, but necessity. These weren't petty thieves. They were people who knew me, my habits, my weaknesses, who chose to weaponize that familiarity. And when the law wasn't enough, I gave them something else. Structure, purpose, a chance to repay what they took, not just in dollars, but in dignity." "And you control how long that repayment lasts?" she asked. "They made the choices," he replied. "I made the rules. But what happens when the rules become their lives? When the punishment outlives the crime?" She left the file with him, filled with timelines, theories, and fragments of hard truth. Ethan didn't open it until after she left. He didn't need to. He knew what it contained. That evening, he sat alone in the penthouse, the city glowing. Below him, a glass of untouched scotch at his side. He didn't feel victory. He didn't feel regret. What he felt was the quiet realization that his control had become the legacy, and that even control has a limit. The next morning, 3 black SUVs left Sentinel's private airstrip and headed west. Inside them were Lena, Ryan, and Elliot, brought together for the first time in 5 years. No handcuffs, no warnings, just quiet professional escorts. They were taken to a restored estate in northern Montana, the very same place they had once been held after their capture. Only this time they were not confined to cells. They were seated in a large glass-walled room overlooking a wide valley, snow still clinging to the edges of the distant hills. Ethan entered the room alone. Lena's eyes locked with his first. There was no hate anymore. Only weariness. "You brought us here to punish us again?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, I brought you here to end this." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" "It means the system I built to teach you discipline, to make you accountable. It's become something else, something unsustainable, and after 5 years I believe it has served its purpose." Elliot looked uncertain. "You're letting us go?" "Not entirely," Ethan replied. "I'm offering you a choice." He handed each of them a folder. Inside, new names, new passports, modest bank accounts, and pre-approved travel plans. Each destination was different. Lena to Iceland, Ryan to Argentina, Elliot to New Zealand. "You can take these and go," Ethan said. "Leave this all behind. Start over. But there are rules. You will never contact each other. You will never contact me. If you do, if you try to expose this or reconnect, I will release everything. All the evidence I've gathered. Every document. Every conversation. Every transfer. You will spend the rest of your lives behind bars. And if we follow the rules, Lena asked, then you're free. Silence followed. Ryan finally asked the question none of them dared until then. Why now? Ethan looked at him, then out the window. Because holding on to something, revenge, punishment, control, it eventually starts to hold on to you. And I'm not interested in being imprisoned by what you did to me. I'm interested in what I can choose to do next. Lena stood. You really think this ends it? He nodded. It does, if you let it. They left the next day, separately, quietly. No fanfare, no final words. Lena's plane took her through Reykjavik, where she started a small consulting firm for social programs. She lived in a small home by the water, rarely speaking of her past. Ryan settled in Mendoza, Argentina, where he began painting again, not for galleries, but for himself. His studio was open air, his life humble. Elliot took a position at a rural university in New Zealand, teaching ethics in financial systems. A strange penance, perhaps, but one he embraced. Ethan never checked in on them directly, but he always knew. One night, nearly a year later, as he looked out at the Boston skyline, Logan stepped beside him. You did the right thing, Logan said. No, Ethan replied. I did the necessary thing. The right thing would have been never needing to do it at all. He paused. But this is as close as we get. And then, for the first time in a long time, Ethan took a sip of his scotch, closed his eyes, and let the silence wash over him, not as a weapon, but as a release. Ethan Carrington's journey began not with vengeance, but with certainty. A man of structure, discipline, and precision, he had built a life where unpredictability was the only true enemy. From the towering heights of his success at Sentinel, risk group to the intimacy of his private life with Lena, Ethan believed that control could solve anything, protect anything. But betrayal has a way of cutting deeper than logic. When Lena, the woman he loved, stole $15 million and ran off with Ryan Holloway, aided by her brother Elliot Price, Ethan was presented with a moment that would redefine his life. For most people, this kind of betrayal would destroy them. But for Ethan, it became something else. An equation, a puzzle, a slow-burning opportunity to turn pain into power. He didn't react with rage. He didn't scream. He observed. What followed was not a traditional revenge story. It wasn't about destroying his enemies. It was about reclaiming authorship of his own life. Ethan used everything he'd learned from years in military intelligence, private security, and human behavior to orchestrate a response that didn't just punish, it reshaped. His wife and her conspirators weren't sent to prison. Instead, they were bound by something far more complex. A life designed by the very man they had tried to escape. Each was given a new identity, a job, a structure. Carefully curated roles that mirrored their guilt in ironic, poetic ways. Lena, the woman, who claimed to feel trapped, was tasked with liberating others. Ryan, the artist who thought he could outsmart the system, was forced to create under someone else's rules. Elliot, who saw Ethan's methods as oppressive, became a watchdog against fraud, forever hunting the very behavior he once committed. For years, they obeyed. They lived in different cities, performed well enough, and tried to adjust to the new rhythms of their invisible chains. But time reveals true nature, and eventually, cracks formed. Lena and Ryan, unable to fully abandon the bond forged in secrecy and sin, tried to escape again. Their plan was clever, elaborate, and deeply human. It was built on hope, a dangerous thing. But they never truly left Ethan's grasp. He had seen the signs. He allowed the plan to unfold, allowed them to believe they had broken free, only to reveal, at the final moment, that they had never stepped outside his design. Even freedom had been staged. And yet, 5 years into this game of cause and consequence, something shifted. Ethan began to question not the actions of his betrayers but his own. Had he become trapped in his own need for control? Was he now the one behind invisible walls? The confrontation with a quiet, persistent private investigator forced him to see that power without end becomes obsession. And obsession becomes a prison, no matter how high the tower from which you look down. So he chose mercy, not weakness, not forgiveness, but release. A final, calculated act that offered Lena, Ryan, and Elliot the opportunity to start again. Free from him, but never. Free from what they had done, they accepted. They scattered across the globe, living quiet, smaller lives under different names, with the constant knowledge that their freedom was conditional and that someone somewhere still held the strings. Ethan let them go not because he had changed his mind, but because he had evolved. He realized that the truest form of power wasn't in holding on. It was in knowing when to let go. And so, the story ends not with fire, not with ruin, but with silence, with distance, with lives forever altered by a single decision, and a man who turned betrayal into a legacy of control. What can we learn from Ethan's story? In a world that glorifies reaction, instant anger, immediate judgment, explosive revenge, Ethan chose patience. He chose intention. He chose to respond, not react. And though his methods were extreme, the principle behind them is profoundly human and timeless. You don't have to lose control when the world betrays you. You can shape your response. You can build something from the ashes. Ethan's journey reminds us that boundaries, structure, and clarity are not just weapons. They're tools for healing. When someone breaks your trust, you don't need to shout the loudest. You don't need to hurt them in return. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is choose a path that reaffirms your values and refuses to let their betrayal define your future. Apply this in your own life. When someone wrongs you, ask, what do I want to come of this pain? A cycle of destruction? Or a structure that protects me from future harm? Don't allow betrayal to make you bitter. Let it make you better, wiser, stronger, more discerning. You don't always have to forgive, but you can always choose what kind of person you'll become because of what happened. And most importantly, remember this. Revenge may feel satisfying in the moment, but mastery of your emotions, your future, and your values will always outlast any short-lived act of retaliation. Now, we want to hear from you. What would you have done in Ethan's position? Would you have turned them in and walked away? Would you have pursued them, like Ethan did, to reclaim your sense of control? Or do you believe that letting go entirely is the only true path to freedom? Let us know in the comments below. We're curious to hear your thoughts and what you would have done in a situation like this. Your answers might just inspire someone else. And if you enjoyed this story, if it moved you, surprised you, made you think, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Your support helps us continue creating more deeply emotional, morally complex, and thought-provoking stories like this one. There's more to come, and we can't wait to share it with you.